and they say the gerrymander is fine. So it was 54% of voters chose a Democratic candidate for the state assembly. Republicans they now have 63 of the state's 99 assembly seats. That's messed up. They keep that gerrymander in. They pass laws like they did on Friday of last week saying we're not going to postpone the primary because there is a re-election or I should say a new election for a new state Supreme Court justice. And they had seen that absentee ballots coming in from Waukesha County were outpacing Milwaukee County significantly. So they said, we've got the votes. You got to have the vote on Tuesday of this week. And we're going to appeal the decision that said that you could extend the absentee ballots to the 13th because people didn't know that they needed to get them because they didn't realize it was going to be so difficult to vote because of coronavirus. The U.S. Supreme Court just basically said, nope, they've got to be in by today. And if they're not, the vote doesn't count. Meanwhile, there are five polling places in Milwaukee when usually there are, I think, like 500. We can ask, maybe there's 70. I don't know. I can tell you it's a fraction. We'll ask John Nichols, who's on the ground in Wisconsin, in just a moment. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program the national affairs correspondent for The Nation magazine and the host of the podcast Next Left for The Nation magazine, John Nichols. John, welcome back to the program.
It's an honor to be with you, my friend.
You've got a new cover story for The Nation magazine called How to Win in Wisconsin. That is obviously about the general election, but there's also there's an election today. One of those things being it's obviously a Democratic primary, but it's also an election for the state Supreme Court. Back up and walk us through how in the world there is a primary election today in Wisconsin when we have seen the data as to how Michigan having their primary may have increased the infection rate of coronavirus. I mean, what we've seen in the past, like 48 hours, has been every single problem with with the courts and their involvement in our election process that one could imagine, it seems.
You are correct, my friend. Wisconsin, my home state, my family's home state for 6 generations, historically had two things that were really great about it. Terrific elections and, frankly, a really strong commitment to public health. It was a state that in the influenza epidemic of 1918 did dramatically better than the rest of the country because it was about the only place that actually locked down. And so Wisconsin has all these great traditions. Unfortunately, they've intersected with the horrible politics of our times. So on this day, April 7th, Wisconsin had a scheduled election. A lot of people nationally are focusing on the presidential primary, the Democratic primary especially, and also to some extent on the state Supreme Court race. It's important to understand that this is also a day when literally hundreds of local offices, city council, county board, mayors, village presidents are elected, including the mayor of Milwaukee is up for election, the county executive of Milwaukee County, our largest city, largest county. So it's actually a very big election day. And the interesting thing is that there's a lot at stake for conservatives and for progressives. It's very typical in this deeply divided state. But here's where things really came apart. Every state that had an election scheduled in this period, as this pandemic has risen to a level that it's the focus of everything going on in the country, as well as the economic downturn. Every state that in this period right now had a primary has moved it. They have generally moved it to early June. In Wisconsin, because we have divided government, a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature, was much more difficult to do that. The governor tried to work with the legislature repeatedly. He called them into special session. He did negotiations, everything to try to delay this election, to postpone it. The Republicans refused. So finally, yesterday afternoon, Governor Tony Evers announced in the early afternoon that he was postponing in-person voting because public health people had said he should do it. Civil rights and voting rights groups had said he should do it. The mayors of all of our major cities said he should do it. I mean, there was this overwhelming call to postpone in a graceful way. What he said was absentee ballots that have already been cast will be counted. People can continue casting absentee ballots into June. And then in early June, if indeed we've passed through the worst of this pandemic, we may also have in-person voting. But he canceled the in-person voting for today. Republicans in the legislature immediately objected. They had mocked him. They had ridiculed him. They had attacked him. They had refused to cooperate with him on this. And then they attacked him for taking action. They sued in the state Supreme Court and within hours got a state Supreme Court from a majority on that court that is closely aligned with the Republicans in the legislature, blocking what the governor had done. And then the U.S. Supreme Court, responding to another conservative lawsuit, upended absentee voting. And so we have this horrible situation today where across Wisconsin, tens of thousands of people are lining up to go to polling places. And they're doing so at a point where we believe the majority of poll workers are not going to be working, where cities across the state have had to dramatically reduce their number of polling places. In Milwaukee, for instance, they have 180 polling places. Their system was set up because that was the number that was needed for a city of that size. They now have 5. And the lines to vote in those 5 polling places go around blocks, down streets, through parking lots. It is a nightmare scenario where the county executive of Milwaukee County says the coronavirus will be spread further because of the decisions made by the courts and these Republican politicians, and where the county executive says more people will die.
There's so much to be just completely both enraged and just and shocked by. I mean, the idea that the United States Supreme Court would look at this and not even consider, would narrowly tailor their question in such a way so as to completely disenfranchise. I mean, you're disenfranchising people in about 6 different ways in this instance. I exaggerated the number of polls in Milwaukee, but I mean, people should just contemplate for a moment. 180 down to 5. I mean, there's no physical way for those 5 polling places to even provide a fraction of the opportunity to vote that 180 would. I mean, I guess technically a fraction, but it is like it is what? It's
a small fraction.
2%, right? I mean, that's basically what it is.
And let me give you another example, my friend, just to say that this is statewide. It's not just in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is where, we've had the highest level of coronavirus cases, where we have had the highest level of deaths. And so it's a particular concern for a whole bunch of reasons. But in Waukesha, a community with a substantial Latino population, they had dozens of polling places. They're down to 1. In communities across the state where you had many, many polling places, they're down to 1 or 2. And there was a report late last week that as many as 100 jurisdictions simply did not have poll workers. And they just didn't have people to do it.
And is my understanding correct that the Republican-controlled legislature is aware that there has been a more absentee ballots coming in from Waukesha, which is traditionally, those absentee ballots come in from Waukesha, that is traditionally Republican voters. Is that right?
I think that they, in anticipation of this moment, there's no question that they ramped up their advocacy for absentee voting in the last week or so as this issue heightened. Now, it's true that also there's a large level of absentee voting in much of the state because people were scared, and a lot of people put in applications. But here's where things really get. Sam,
I'm sorry, we lost you for a second.
You're right that in some places, what's that?
We lost you for 1 second.
Oh, I was going to say, here's where things get incredibly messy. There was in some places you had early messages to get your absentee ballot, do it, take care of it. But there's a lot of the state where people traditionally vote in person. It's just how it's been for a very long time. And I'm one of those people who historically has voted in person. And as this crisis came, you had a late surge of people asking for absentee ballots, particularly from Milwaukee County and from Racine, from Beloit, places with large African-American and Latino populations, and a lot of large working class populations, people saying, oh, I better not do what I usually do, which is to vote in person, but to get an absentee ballot. It was such a crushing, overwhelming demand from these places that clerks were working in some cases as many as 110 hours a week to get the ballots turned around. A federal judge last Friday said, this is too overwhelming. While he did not postpone the election, he did extend the amount of time when you could apply for an absentee ballot. And then he extended the amount of time in which you could get it through the mail, fill it out, get it back, and have it processed. And so basically he gave another week into early next week to kind of make this whole process work. It was a practical decision that simply extended the absentee balloting. And the Supreme Court yesterday, the U.S. Supreme Court shut that down.
That's what's so
as of this afternoon.
That's what's so amazing about that ruling. They knew that people were operating under the understanding that they had a couple of extra days to get that ballot in, and without any warning, basically said wrong, no, end of story. I mean, that's what's so. That's one of the things that's so shocking about this. Let me ask you this, John. Why couldn't in Ohio, DeWine did not cancel the election? What he did was he said the election can take place, but the Board of Health or the state's health department said stay at home order. You can't go out. So the election will take place, but you can't do it. Why didn't they do that in Wisconsin?
They did. Essentially, what Tony Evers announced yesterday afternoon, Monday afternoon, at around 1:00, was essentially what DeWine had done. He said we can't do now he took the responsibility on himself personally. DeWine had his health secretary step up and do it, but the health secretary for Wisconsin